Here we go. Hello. Can you see us?
Hello. Yes, I can see you, thank you. And may I say right away that I would prefer to be there with you in person in London. I love being in London, but we'll do what we can here in this short time.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it and love the opportunity to talk to you. I'm actually quite a science fiction geek, and I really enjoyed your book because it felt quite optimistic, I have to say. Even though it looked into the future and a lot of people died and there was droughts and there was famine and the icebergs melted, it kind of felt like it wasn't all bad. So I kind of wanted to start off just asking you a very simple question, which is, when you're writing these kinds of books, it kind of gives a glimpse into the path that we could take and the path that we might decide not to if we make the right decisions. And I wonder, from your perspective, are you feeling optimistic after sort of seeing the state of the globe now, after writing your latest book?
Well, I always have to tread a fine line there. Being optimistic in the situation that we're in can seem a little naive or stupid or blind, but given the election results from Brazil that are just 2 days old, I'm going to say we are in a mixed picture of good and bad. There is never going to stop the bad news in our lifetimes, and yet the world's aware of it now. Good things like Lula winning are happening. And so I would urge a willed optimism, or a sense of Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, that you simply assert that we have to stay optimistic as an obligation to the generations to come, if that's a driver emotionally for doing the necessary work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think about one of your other novels, which comes to mind to me, New York 2140, where, the rising levels has left people sort of trapped in a building. And I think one of the things that's common from that book to this book is that you kind of make it obvious that no one involved in any of the decision-making, whether it be politicians, scientists, humanitarians, people off the street, no one's very evil. There's no sort of villain in this. And I wonder, when you think about this in real life, you see the inaction that a lot of governments are having across the world, sort of trying to reach any kind of climate target. I wonder, do you think that the lack of villains is solely confined in the realm of science fiction? Do we have villains in real life, do you think?
Well, I resist this term. The culture, in its most diffuse social media way, has an urge to either heroes or villains. Mm-hmm. And then you can celebrate them or castigate them. And you have people making decisions. I can say Putin's invasion of the Ukraine was a villainous act, criminal and wrong. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the Russian government is looking down the barrel of a gun, in that they depend entirely on selling their fossil fuels for their income, and their society will fall apart when they don't get to sell their fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. They're one of the worst case scenarios for any number of petrostates who are under a severe double bind. For the biosphere's sake, they can't sell their fossil fuels. And indeed, by way of the Paris Agreement, they've agreed to a process where they can't. On the other hand, in sheer economic terms, for their own national budgets, they have to sell their fossil fuels or they go broke and their society falls apart. Mm-hmm. So all of us are implicated in that double bind. And you could always say, oh my gosh, I'm a villain. I flew to London for this conference. But this just isn't what people want to do. It isn't the right way to think about it. We're all implicated in a massive problem, and there are going to be people making terrible decisions in terms of solving this problem by sticking their head in the sand, by doing a Götterdämmerung approach. Let's burn the world down because it's easier and more fun. And it seems to absolve us of an overwhelming sense of guilt to future generations. On the other hand, there's a lot of people fighting the good fight. So I wrote Ministry for the Future in a darker time than now. Yeah. 2019 was worse. It looked like Trump would win the election in America, and the pandemic had not yet slapped us in the face and taught us lessons about global response that are good lessons. So in some ways, we're actually in a better moment, than we were, and we're in a better moment than we were on Saturday before the Brazilian election. So I think you just have to claw onto what good news you can and keep on fighting without the hero-villain duology.
Can I ask, just to delve into the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, which you've brought up, how do you think, speaking as someone who is creative and who has sort of envisioned in a very practical way what could play out, what do you believe the exit ramps could be for these states who are petro-states and rely on petrochemicals? And do you think there is such a thing as an exit ramp?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think we need it despite its non-existence, this exit ramp. Let's put it not just on Russia getting out of that war. That's a particular and very nasty problem. More generally, the petrostates, they're going to have to be compensated and supported through the transition to clean energy. We can't just let them crash. It's about 2 billion people and it will wreck all the rest of us. So compensation, there's the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, there's the Paris Agreement, there's the International Monetary Fund's special development disbursements. I'm forgetting the exact title for this, but essentially it's carbon quantitative easing that needs to be created and money paid to even keeping it in the ground to keep economies and people alive. Mm-hmm. That compensation would have to be discounted for sure. They'll take a haircut. It'll have to be amortized. It'll have to be paid out over time in the same way that they would sell it. And it'll have to be entailed in that they'll be signing on to obligations to go green, so that you have quite a complicated but necessary armature that would have to be built here to get all of civilization through this transition. So yes, I'm glad you brought this up because I don't think it's discussed enough. Mm-hmm. It does involve trillions that don't exist, that need to be perhaps made up from scratch in a quantitative easing way, and then dispersed to some cases. So these petrostates are kleptocracies. That'll have to be beaten down and the actual people involved given the compensation to do good green work. There's going to be nothing gnarlier than this part of the problem going forward.
Mm-hmm. And obviously all this involves politics. I know after you wrote Ministry of the Future, you were invited to work with the UK delegation of COP26. It must be an interesting situation for you as a writer to be sort of amongst all these people who are asking sort of real world questions. What did that experience teach you?
It was an astonishing, perhaps like a couple of years of graduate school in 1 week.
Right.
So an astonishing experience, and I have nothing but thanks for my hosts at the UN, for Nigel Topping in the UK, to give me that opportunity, and I hope I can put it to use somehow going forward, because in a way it was overwhelming. But what I saw was a whole community of people doing really good work, that the COP process is indispensable, that at the same time it's not enough, that it's like taking the world's temperature and everybody makes promises there, like a marriage that then later you might want to get a divorce from, but you can't. So it's a very peculiar thing, and we're seeing it start up again in Egypt. There are promises that are being made at COP that are then being broken later, and it's creating cynicism and discouragement. But we nevertheless can't give up on it. The process is indispensable, that we keep coming together, looking at each other, taking the temperature, making the promises, and then the real work happens back at home, and your audience in their work, everybody in their daily work. That's the real work of dealing with climate change. And COP is just a place to try to coordinate that work and look at everybody else doing it, hopefully for some mutual encouragement and some networking. I saw a lot of that at Glasgow, of private capital going to COP in order to find opportunities for investment, for reward financially, because this is going to be a giant process that has to be paid for and has to be done through businesses finding opportunities to make money in the work needed to get us through this crisis. So it's what I learned at Glasgow was that it's hyper complex, but it's also being organized too.
Yeah. I mean, delving a little bit into that cynicism, which is obviously derived from these broken promises of saying we're going to achieve something and then not. I kind of wonder what your experience was like, because if you think about the role of science fiction in things, in the way people see things, it's almost hard seeing how the planet is going, and the alarm systems and the red lights flashing, and oh my goodness, things actually seem to be going so badly. What do you think the role of science fiction is in not just raising awareness of the situation, but also providing a path to show people what to do? Because your work in particular as a writer has a lot of realism in it, right? You show sort of what could be done in a very realistic way to fix things, or at least sort out the most dire consequences, right? So I wonder, what role do you think science fiction has in all of this now that things seem to be coming true?
Well, we are in a science fiction novel that we're all co-authoring together. And it looks like it could be a dystopian science fiction novel, but we want it to be a utopian science fiction novel. So there's a genre clash, and you have to focus on utopia. Well, now utopia is the name for the place that'll never happen because it's too perfect, and you laugh at it because it's naive and idealistic. Mm-hmm. But if utopia is also a necessity now, in that we have to succeed or we crash badly, then you want it to be the best case scenario. And it does need to feel realistic while you are imagining it, while you're reading the novel, while you're talking it over in a group. It needs to be a best case scenario rather than the perfect, which can be the enemy of the good. It'll be a mixed picture. And so utopia now has a very low bar. We need to dodge the mass extinction event and keep civilization healthy. That's the minimum. And now that looks utopian because we are in such a dire situation at this moment. Mm-hmm. So what I found is trying it out in the Ministry for the Future is, it's 2 years since that book came out. People are hungry for that story. The book has had an astonishing response. I put it flatly to you, and I've seen it myself probably better than anyone. Many have probably never even heard of this book in the room, but on the other hand, a lot of people have heard of it, read of it. And what I think happens is it organizes their own utopian project. What you're doing to try to help is one brick in a bigger wall. Mm-hmm. And there is a macro story of us succeeding and scraping through. And so, of course, we need more versions of that macro story. But in the meantime, the Ministry for the Future has served as a kind of a spark. Ah, yes, this sounds plausible. It might be possible. Therefore, we have to pursue it, and I'm doing my part, and now I know that other people are as well. Mm-hmm. So yes, science fiction has that role, and we're all science fiction writers all the time. We're always predicting futures for ourselves, or outlining futures, doing modeling exercises or scenarios or forecasts. They aren't exactly the same as predictions. They aren't prophecy, but they're guiding narratives. And so everybody has an instinctive sense of these things already from doing it in their own lives. And the art forms that do it are maybe the least important part of it.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to give any spoilers away to those of you who haven't read the book, but one of my favorite things about it was a concept that I thought was quite clever, and I want to ask you whether you think it could be a reality, which is that reserve currency backed by central banks to promote decarbonization by paying companies when they extract carbon from the air or when they stop the emissions completely. Do you think that's one of the outcomes that could actually become a reality, rather than penalizing and taxing companies, being like, well, if you want to get a tax break, you must do this in exchange?
Yes, I think that's right. And luckily, it's not just my opinion, it's an observation that in conversations with central banks, with the US Federal Reserve, with people at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, it's quantitative easing. We saw it work in 2008. We saw it work when the pandemic hit in 2020. The directed creation of new money that gets injected into the economy strategically to do certain things, they're calling it carbon quantitative easing. For private capital, it's being called risk-adjusted investment. That's a key term because it really means paying attention to climate change outcomes in terms of what investments will work and what not. But to get back to the central banks, the network for um, greening the financial system, a real organization of 90 central banks, all the big ones, is writing white papers on this and urging central banks to think about it, and urging legislators to direct their central banks to do these things, a very necessary component. So it's both uh, fiscal policy and monetary policy, to put it in their terms. It's both legislative action and then also central bank actions. And what's encouraging to me is this isn't just something that I described. I was more a reporter than an inventor there, for sure. It's really happening in the real world. And it's one of the things that is going to save us, because there's an awful lot of work needed. A lot of it is not-for-profit work, and nobody wants 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That is simply waste that has to be, like a waste disposal system, has to be paid for, but it's not a consumer good. So government comes into play, and central banks therefore come into play.
Yeah, so you talk a lot about urging people, urging banks, and again today you've mentioned how we have to avoid a mass extinction event, and you've said this before. And I wonder, with all the urgency that's necessary, with all the people urging, why do you think something big hasn't happened yet to try and solve this?
I'm wondering, I'm going to suggest to you that something big has been happening since the pandemic began. A radical shift of consciousness, climate change on the front burner of every discussion, and even Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is put into the context of forcing a quicker transition to clean energy in Europe, et cetera. It's the overriding story of our time. So maybe what's happening is it'll never look quite right. It won't look like World War II. And since you're in London, I can say maybe it's an analogy to ponder. When bombs are falling on your head, the government takes over and says, everybody has to get on board and do these things. It's all hands on deck, but let's organize this economy to fight this war. Well, that's a vivid analogy, especially if you're in London. And what you have to understand is the damages of climate change in the 21st century might be worse in the end than the damages of World War II to Europe and the rest of the world, but it'll never look like that because it won't be bombs falling on your head unless you're in Ukraine. But for the rest of it's going to be more diffuse, it's going to be over the horizon, and it's never going to look like World War II, but it's going to be as big and all-encompassing. And therefore, the role for government in guiding the economy, we're back to Keynes. We need Keynesianism. The neoliberal free market moment of 1980 to 2020 is over, has to be over for us to get through this poly crisis. So once you adjust to that, many things come into focus.
I wonder, because obviously for a lot of people in Europe, for example, just looking very simplistically at the energy crisis that we're facing this winter, a lot of people will not have lived through blackouts, and they're expecting that to be a thing this winter. A lot of people will not have seen the energy prices be so high ever in their lives before. Do you feel that public consciousness has a part to play here? Because that is very much what seems to be urging policy on the ground locally in countries. But do you think that will make a difference in the long run, that people are more conscious than ever before of how this will impact them in the West?
I hope so. It seems obvious that it will. Now, whether that turns into some part of the population will say, look, tribalism, nationalism, let's hunker down, it's all other people's faults. That kind of right-wing response will indeed happen. But Europe is particularly good because of being part of the European Union, which really the UK made a mistake to leave. That by being part of the European Union, you're a member state rather than a nation state. And a nation state is supposedly sovereign and is in complete control of its territory. This is a 17th century notion that is no longer applicable in the modern world. we are all member states of the Paris Agreement, of the UN, and in Europe, the nations are member states of the European Union, which has quite a bit of legal power. It changes consciousness. You're not just a citizen of your nation, you are a citizen of a union and of the world, and it has legal and emotional repercussions to think of yourself as part of a member state in something larger. We need more of that, and Europe's leading the way in that consciousness. It's problematic, and it creates all kinds of backlashes and weird side effects, and yet a necessary mental shift for all of humanity. So in some senses, Europe is again leading the way, and we'll just have to see what happens, but it's a lesson we all have to learn. And I would say the United States has been particularly bad in learning that lesson, and being a member state with giant powers like China, like the BRIC countries, these are becoming a member state in the Paris Agreement is something that the US has to learn, and has been actually doing a tremendous job of catching up since 2020. The passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a climate change act by the Biden administration, was huge. It was as big as Bolsonaro's defeat and Lula's victory. And so we have to look at what good's happening and try to rally around it.
Mm-hmm.